Hi everyone, welcome to our At Home this month. It's really lovely that you've all joined us. Um, I am sorry if I cough at all. I've just had a really horrible virus and I keep on coughing and spluttering. So I'll try and mute myself so that I don't do that too, obviously. But we have got three great papers for you today. Same format as usual. So we will do paper, and then Anna, who is there, is going to monitor the questions. So do please put your questions in the chat, and Anna will keep an eye on those. So after each paper, we will have a few minutes for questions for each speaker. And we've got three across the Atlantic for us speakers today, from Washington, from Rio, from Brazil, and from Minnesota. So amazing. I think without further ado, then we'll get underway and introduce our first speaker, Alden O'Brien, who we have welcomed here before with the network. And she's here today to tell us about her new exhibition. Thank you, Alden.
Thank you. Let's see if we can get this working again. Whoops, and I didn't go back to the first slide, so let's do that. Oh dear. Sorry, it's been a while since I did one of these, and you get rusty, don't you? Share. And full screen. There we go. All right, well, thank you for having me. I was invited to talk about this because my current exhibit deals with dressmakers and tailors in various ways. And now I'm just manipulating my two screens to make sure I get my text. Sorry. The show is called Sewn in America, Making Meaning Memory. And the first half of the show, and it looks at the role sewing played in women's lives in the 18th and 19th centuries, and how women used their needles to earn a living or to express themselves in various ways. And it also includes some examples of 20th and 21st century needlework and quilts to show how women are still sewing, knitting, and crocheting to express emotions, celebrate identity, or for benevolence and to support causes. So today's theme of dressmaking, business, and collections is pertinent in several sections. Here at the right, you see a large segment of the making section, which is sort of a timeline looking at the evolution of dressmaking, construction, and from custom made to and professionally made to homemade, coexisting, of course, and overlapping, to ready to wear. And because of the layout of the room, it goes from right to left, and you can't in this shot see the first dress here, but we move from when you really needed a skilled professional to drape the fashionable dresses to flat patterning of the 19th century, which got increasingly complicated, but opened the door for more home sewing, and eventually, with the help from emerging technologies, led to the pattern and ready-made industry. So here on the left is the first dress in that lineup, along with the next two, which I'm showing inside out, because I figured if this is an exhibit about sewing, well, let's show the darn sewing. So everybody gets kind of excited to see these. The first one is from the 1820s, and the other is has an event of a reception of an anniversary reception of 1886 inscribed on the Petersham, so we know the date. And I think that it's pretty easy for even the non-sewing viewer to grasp that dressmaking was getting more complicated, and you could, it wouldn't be so difficult for a home sewer to make the 1820s dress. You might get the dressmaker to drape the pattern for you, as many manuals suggested. But by the 1880s, the number of bodice pieces, the complicated draping, the many different layers of infrastructure really mean you either need a professional again, or you're being assisted by some of the new technology. Of course, the sewing machine is one example, so we have this in the show, but I also read a lot of articles that challenged the common view that it really revolutionized home sewing within just a few years. And so even within the confines of a brief label, we're told to keep it under 50 words, which doesn't give you a lot of leeway. I wanted to address that by saying it revolutionized things, but it took a while. And throughout here, I'm adding a few bibliographical citations, certainly not exhaustive. I've left out some of the other, some things that were also very helpful to me, but I wanted to throw in some of the articles and books that were most helpful to me. So we have a case with some basic examples of some of the major highlights along the development of paper patterns, starting with the Godey's Ladies book of the little tiny scaled patterns. Then these wonderful, dizzying, overlapping patterns of from Harper's Bazaar, which are, you know, an ADHD person like me's nightmare. And then, of course, the paper pattern industry. And you didn't get printing of, you know, this is the seam line, this is where to gather or anything till the 1920s. So it was still a bit of a challenge. Less well known are the dozens of pattern drafting systems patented in the second half of the century. And not all of them, of course, were necessarily marketed or successful, but many of them were. And here's an example of a dress made with the pattern that you see here. And so we display them together, and it's pretty cool to have those together. And I wanted to try to figure out how to use this. You take your measurements, you put the cardboard onto some paper that will become your pattern, and you mark each measurement. You see these lines along there, and you say, okay, well, the bust was 34, and it says to mark the 34 dot right there, or the shoulder measurement was 9 inches, so you mark 9 inches right there, or whatever it is. And then you connect the dots with this curved piece, and you end up with a custom drafted pattern, which was actually going to be more easy to fit to you, more custom than the paper patterns, which are always going to take an adjustment. But it's not exactly simple. It's going to be outdated in a few years. This is an 1884 pattern drafting system, which she used in the fall of 1889 for her January 1890 wedding, but pretty soon after that, that bodice is going to be outdated, and the system is going to have to be outdated. So anyway, we tried remaking it, and it wasn't that difficult, and we hope to upload a video of drafting this to show the process, because it's definitely not intuitive when you look at the object. The shirtwaist deserves really an article or an exhibit all of its own. There's so much to say about it. It was the watershed garment for the ready-to-wear industry for women's garments. It's a starting point to talk about factories and the labor movement, about its use in sport and by college women and by business women and so on. And as Barbara Schreier discusses in her exhibit catalog, it was a symbol to thousands of immigrants of embracing American culture. It was a sort of uniquely American outfit, and available at every price point. So the shirtwaist lets me introduce all of those topics. And of course, all of this is so briefly touched on in a label. It's very frustrating, but a catalog allows you to get into a little bit more of that. So the next section is about meaning, but also sort of why you sew. And one big reason was necessity, sewing out of necessity. And at home, that means that women had to be making all of these different garments. And in the back, you see sheets and towels and pillowcases and bolsters and napkins and the grain bag and so on. And so I wanted this wall to sort of show, you know, the bulk of how much sewing women had to do before they could go on to the fun stuff. And so I love this installation, and people are kind of struck by, oh, wow, you know, when you look at the quilts, you don't realize this is what they're also doing. But returning to the professional side of it, the other necessary needlework is sewing to earn a living. And here I wanted to also include men, because of course there were plenty of professions in which men were sewing professionally. And that was usually the context in which men sewed. So we have a few objects from the garment trades and non-garment trades to remind people of these trades which are often forgotten that did involve sewing. And Mark Hutter, the tailor at Colonial Williamsburg, counted about 60 trades in the London Book of Trades from the 18th century, which involved sewing. And I had room for only a few, but I have the shoes and the gloves. I have the wallets to represent leatherworking. We don't have room for a great big saddle. I chose this falling apart book because you get to actually see the thread sewing the pages together. And we have this sailmaker's needle and its case. And of course, the sailmaking needle is about 5 or 6 inches long, and it's really heavy. And this wallet is pretty wonderful because it's got the date inscribed in it. So we show it so that you can see that. Stay making, of course, we were able to photograph it all looking as if it's floating in air, which is cool. But in the gallery, this is a top-down bird's eye view. We show it sort of open. It's one of the ones that just curls on itself. No matter how I tried, I couldn't get that right side to uncurl. But it's great because the last layer of lining has worn away to a certain extent, and then you get to see some of the sewing and the interlay lining and layers, and it's very coarsely stitched in a lot of cases. And so this myth of, oh, everything was so beautifully and finely stitched back then, not always. It didn't always need to be. So returning to the women, we use this dress, which is perfect for the purpose because we have the name not only of the woman who wore it to her wedding, but most unusually that of her dressmaker, who was her neighbor in the census. We see them at adjacent farms, and perhaps a friend. And Rebecca, the dressmaker, was extraordinarily skillful as she managed to minimize the visual appearance of Sarah Ann's apparent curvature of the spine. You can see one shoulder is higher than the other. When years ago I was dressing this with a series of 2-inch ethafoam discs, which you just stack, and you can get a very precise, you measure it every 2 inches, and then you get a very precise thing. And the only way it worked was if we curved that stack of discs to reflect a curvature of the spine. And it's kind of extraordinary that was one of the few mannequins I actually went to the trouble of making those discs for, and it just sort of had this big aha moment of what was going on with this dress that simply would not behave unless you did that. And Emily Bach, who's a student in the Winter Tour program, has used this as one of her garments, talking about adaptations for women's spinal deformity. She's found several other garments that accommodate this, and that's her pattern there. And very subtle differences in the measurements, but enough to make this difference. Then we have a bonnet because I wanted to represent milliners. And we don't know the maker of this, but we do know the owner was from Bristol, Rhode Island. There's a milliner's order book in the Winter Tour library, which has all these wonderful things where it'll say Mrs. Avelina, or I can't remember what it says exactly there, Watson, trim like a Tillinghast, just on a flare, such ribbon or near it, white silk or crepe, and for 10, as much as I can afford for 10 shillings or a little more. So all of these she's jotted down all of these orders that she's obviously just taking these notes as the woman is talking to her. And it's like, well, this or that, or as you please. And so this order book gives some insight into that relationship between the milliner or dressmaker and the client, where they're negotiating what style to use. I like it this way, or I bought this hat for retrimming. I want this kind of trim, maybe this, maybe that, kind of like Mrs. Tillinghast, who I saw wearing this bonnet in church last week. It's a wonderful insight into that relationship. So these account books, and I would have loved to have room to show more account books, but people don't really, except those of us who are extremely geeky, don't really spend a lot of time looking at documents, but they show us so much. And I've looked at a lot of tailors and dressmakers account books to get a sense of what are they doing. And it turns out a lot of what they're doing is repairing and mending, or they're doing the pattern making and the cutting, and then they send it home with the customer for the customer's wife to sew. So, oh goody, more to sew. But lots and lots to plumb in those documents. And in the exhibit, we have this trio. We have just a few pages of this account book that belonged to a New Jersey tailor And I suspect that it probably got torn up and divided among different descendants or something. But we also have one pair of his shears or scissors, and a copy of a miniature of him and his wife. And so it's rather wonderful to have all of these. It's always nice if you can put an image to somebody, and to have a three-dimensional object to go along with the two-dimensional is nice. And you see him doing a bunch of different things. These pages don't seem to have a lot of altering or mending, but they have things like a jack coat and a surtout, which is spelled in funny ways, and other things like selling a bushel of rye, or selling whiskey, or renting out his horse. And tailors in small towns had to make ends meet by doing more than just tailoring. And so I see that again and again and again in these account books. And so that's kind of interesting to see as well. And then we are reusing this coat that was in my last clothing exhibit after the agreeable tyrant fashion after the revolution, for which we included a number of scaled patterns a la Janet Arnold in the back. And the tailors at Williamsburg, Mark and Mike, took the pattern, and they said, oh, they always said, we'd love to make a reproduction of this one day. So when I was planning this exhibit, I said, how about if you got started on that reproduction and let us show part of the process. And so we have this front panel shown with the inside out, obviously, and it just kind of shows the level of skill that a tailor would have to be putting all these many different types of fabric. That's, I think, 4 or 5 different fabrics right there, to pad it out and make it smooth and make it hang beautifully, and stiffen it where it needs stiffening, and so on. And so that deceptively simple pattern of that coat actually reflects a great deal of skill. So I wanted to use that. I think it's a great example of using pattern making and reproductions, which I know is something that's being talked about a lot. There have been a couple of terrific symposia I've heard about over on your side of the pond recently. So I guess I've been rushing through this because I was so concerned about not taking up too much time, and hopefully I'm okay here. But in any case, that's a taste of some of the ways that dressmaking and other fashion trades are represented in our collection and highlighted in the exhibit, with addenda from some recreating and other objects and documents. And having so many garments come to us with a family history, of course, is a big head start. And then you add the documents, the period documents, a lot of work by other scholars whose work give me a lot of insights, and so on and so on. And so that way we get a broader treatment of the topic of dressmakers, milliners, and the more lowly ranked women earning a living, barely, with their needle skills. And this exhibit, more than any other I've done, focuses on those makers, and I've really enjoyed having a chance to do that. So thank you. I'll just move on to that. There is a catalog. There will be an online exhibit, and please feel free to email me if you have any additional questions. So I can stop sharing now, I guess.
That catalogue looks spectacular, Alden. Thank you so much.
Sure. I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing.
Uh-huh.
Oh, did I stop sharing or?
No, but
here we go. The stop share window wasn't showing. There it goes.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Anna now, who is fielding questions for Alden's paper.
Great.
Hey, let me just get the chat up. It's my screen's frozen, which is not very cooperative of it. Right, let's see what I can do. Nope.
You want me to do it, Anna?
Ah. Right, so let's start again. Chat. Here we go. Okay, so that was amazing. Really interesting, Alden. Thank you so much. The questions are just coming in. I'm just going to give people a couple of minutes to get their thoughts together and put them into the chat. But can I ask you one in the meantime while we're just waiting? And that is, you talked about how some of the items were difficult to display and how the corset wouldn't behave itself and it wouldn't unroll.
Yes.
And the garments that were specially fitted to a particularly unique body with one shoulder higher. And were there any other garments that presented particular problems with display and mounting?
Well, the bustle dress, that 1880s dress was pretty easy on that particular mannequin. The mannequins which were designed for the Worth Doucet Pingot show 30 or 40 years ago now in Brooklyn have been very, very useful for late 19th century things because they're shaped for exactly what the corset of that period did. And so you put one of those on and it just fits beautifully. You may have to pad, the waist out just a little bit, but the corseted shape is the hardest thing to do. But then it takes copious amounts of petticoats and bustles. And I finally realized, well, this is silly. I've just got to buy a reproduction lobster tail. And so I just went to Amazon and bought a little, costumer's bustle thing. And that helped because it's the only thing that, has the superstructure. Each thing has, its own little challenges. Some of them are just very delicate. We have a number of accessories there. In some cases, I wanted to be able to show samplers and other things with the stitches in the back. And so we took a little piece of twill tape and just made a teeny tiny baby rod pocket as if it were a quilt, and then just created a little U-shaped hanger on and things like that. So my intern who's a graduate student in the FIT program, Bella Moritz, was very helpful in doing some of that, as were my colleagues preparing a lot of that. Our preparators were doing some of it. But and then for the 18th century dresses, of which there are two, I just make I take cardboard and I take a pattern from the lining and I create a cardboard corset, and the lines, the rigids of the cardboard sort of serve as the stays, and then I can score it a little if I need to, and I can cut it and tape it as needed, and then I cover it with Tyvek, and I've got a little reproduction corset that is exactly the right size and shape for that garment. So that's my trick for 18th century garments. It always takes some tweaking, because even though you've taken it from the lining and you've made it a little bit smaller, it always seems to be too big, and so we're always cutting it down. But so it's still always an enormous challenge, and people have no idea that these things can take 6 to 8 hours to really get exactly where you want to. And then you still look at it in the photograph and you go, ooh, I missed that little wrinkle, didn't I?
That's amazing. So quite a few questions have just come in. So Kate's asking, how widespread was the use of those drafting systems? They look somewhat complex to contemporary eyes.
They really do. And you should see the other one. I have one actually that I bought years ago, and it's not part of the DAR collection because we already have one. This thing looks like a medieval object of torture, but you can sort of see that what you do is you take the measurements and you can unscrew these and you just sort of adjust it to the measurement that you need. And then and these are the darts, and this is the waist. And by the end of it, you've got something you can trace. So at first glance, this and that cardboard thing, this was one of the most popular and widespread ones. We see many ads for it. It got updated multiple times throughout the decade, a couple of the 1880s and 90s. So we know it must have been popular enough for that to be happening. The cardboard ones, there are a number of them that do survive in museum collections. And so, they must have been used to some extent if these businesses were in business for several years. But, and a number of the sewing manuals suggest that they are somewhat commonly used and that people know how to use them, because they'll say, well, if you're using this, they debate the utility and ease of using a paper pattern versus one of these. So they have to have been used. Some of them, you also have to wonder to what extent they were used by the home sewer versus the dressmaker. And one suggestion is that they were very much marketed to women who wanted to become dressmakers, but we don't have an apprentice system out over here. And we had this vastly expanding country where people are moving west and moving into rural areas and very small communities. There may not be another trained dressmaker to learn from out there in Nebraska or Montana or Minnesota or wherever, excepting some of the bigger cities, obviously. So it seems, and some of the scholars such as Claudia Kidwell, who's written about these. It seems that a lot of and Wendy Gamber goes into it a lot. Wendy Gamber is fabulous. It seems that this was useful for women who wanted to become dressmakers but didn't have another way of learning from an experienced professional. The downside of this, as I believe Wendy Gamber gets into, is that it kind of flooded the market because there started being more people who were calling themselves dressmakers, not all of whom were truly trained, because, dressmaking is complicated. It's not really something you can completely be self-taught at. And so you start seeing some people complaining about dressmakers not being so great sometimes. And you wonder, is this some of the women who just didn't have that kind of training? So it's complicated. They definitely were used, but it may be something that was more used by the professionals who kind of knew what they were doing or thought they did.
Yeah. So Suzanne is asking about shirtwaists. Apart from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, have you found much information about manufacturers of shirtwaists?
I didn't get deeply into manufacturers of shirtwaists, but considering that Clara Lemlich led the uprising of the 20,000, and that was only in New York City, but spurred sympathetic strikes elsewhere throughout the country, clearly there were tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands then countrywide, of factories making shirtwaists, and home sewers were still making shirtwaists, but it was a very easy thing to churn out. They're not all that complicated until you start putting the pretty little tucks and trim and lace inserts. So I personally did not do on hand, primary research on those, but other people have, and some of the books are A Needle, a Bobbin, a Strike, which looks at various labor history things in the garment industry, and I can't think right now, but other people have looked at that and looked at the shirtwaist, and there were many places, and none of them had good labor practices.
Indeed. So Robin's asking if you could say just very briefly, a little more about the myth of sewing machine revolutionizing home sewing, and is this more present in the catalogue? Do you have a chance to explore that?
Yes, I did want to take a chance to explore that in the catalogue a bit, because I think it's really interesting, and I think, this was a challenge because this exhibit was including so many different objects from so many different periods and several different cultures. So all of a sudden I'm going down a rabbit hole on the history of sewing machine technology and patents, and how much did one cost in 1870 versus 1850, and so on. But some of the articles that I cited, that if anyone wants, I can email you with more. Nancy Page Fernandez I think I cited 3 different things she's published that really challenge the extent to which that was used. Someone else looks at Civil War use of sewing machines and says, first of all, it was much more prevalent in the North than the South, which doesn't surprise us. That the North was able to integrate the use of sewing machines into more of their production for the army. People have started to, there are these scholars who have said, it really wasn't affordable till much later than we thought. When the patent agreement of the early manufacturers ran out around 1870, then there could be more competition and prices could start coming down. And of course, there's the thing that you can do a lot of the seams with the sewing machine, and I was surprised to learn how many specified attachments were available very early on. But you still have to sew a lot of the things by hand. And we also conventionally say, oh, all of a sudden there's this explosion of trim on garments. And yes, if you look at the fashion plates of the 1860s, they've got a profusion of trim. But I wanted to find an 1860s dress to say, oh, look how much trim suddenly people are putting on. And you actually can't find that many that have huge profusions of trim. Starting in the 1870s and 80s, you get lots and lots of the box pleated trims and swag, all kinds of stuff going on in the bustle period. But while all of that is the main seams are done with the machine, they're still tacked on by hand. So, and a lot of the things are, a lot of the finishing stitches are done by hand. So that's part of the reason that it's, you know, it's complicated. Yes, they're using it. And also dressmakers, a lot of the dressmakers are still not able to afford it, even after 1870. And the seamstresses who could most easily benefit from it. You know, Godey's goes on and says, oh, this is going to be such a liberator to those poor seamstresses. And now they'll be able to earn more money because they can stitch things faster and make more things and serve more customers and get more money. And of course, that never happens. It never happens that way. Technology is always a little bit of a snare and a delusion. All it did was bring wages right back down because the work becomes even more devalued. So these various articles I was reading were going into all of those different aspects of it. And interestingly, I found a quote from, I can't remember whether I found it cited in one of the articles or whether I stumbled on it myself, forgive me. If it's, I think I used it in the catalog, and if so, it'll say so-and-so quoted in such and such. I like to go back and find the original and then see if there's another tidbit that I'd like to quote. So I did see it in Godey's, but there was actually a New York Times article quite early on saying, you know, this sewing machine is not all it's cracked up to be. You know, it's not going to really save anyone time because people are going to start raising their expectations essentially, and that's exactly what ended up happening.
Sure. Kate, how are we doing for time?
Yeah, I think what
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, it's brilliant. It's so fascinating. Any other questions that are there? Alden will be able to have a read and can reply to.
Yes, I'd be happy to look in the chat and start taking as I listen to that.
There are quite a few, Alden. There's some really interesting questions following
great. Okay.
from sewing machine usage.
So it's my great pleasure now. Thank you so much, Alden, to speak to Cecilia Soares, who is going to talk to us today. Cecilia is an independent scholar who is working in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Her first book, and I don't want to try and pronounce that. Cecilia, can you tell us what your book is called?
Of course. Thank you all. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me today. Just a short mention about my first book before I started presenting here. It's called, if we were going to translate it in English, Barons and Clogs. It's about shoe production and consumption in Brazil. I hope to be able to share an English-speaking version with you all soon.
Amazing. Right, I'll hand over to you, Cecilia, your paper, A Transatlantic Wardrobe.
Okay, people, I'm not going to talk about shoes today. Instead, is everyone able to see?
Yes.
Awesome. So instead today, I wanted to bring to you guys an example of a very interesting sartorial collection I found in Brazil while I was doing this shoe research. And that is actually very special because it's an opportunity for us to understand not only a particular, very prestigious related collection of sartorial goods from the Belle Époque, but also be able to tie these goods to a specific family from Brazil. So I think this brings an interesting context for us. So I'd like to start by giving you guys a context about this very specific museum. I never heard about it before, even if I am Brazilian. And it's interesting because it is a house museum. So it used to be the former house of this family called the Cheiraleite, and they were very wealthy and peculiar. They came from the coffee production in Brazil, but slowly they changed their kind of production and became finance investors instead. So we are talking about the father, a mother, and two daughters, and especially the youngest one, who was called Euphrasia, became a very important investor in Paris during the second half of the 19th century. So it is very interesting because the family had European connections, like an uncle used to live in Europe during the childhood of the kids, Francisca and Euphrasia. So they moved there to try to heal some kind of disease that the oldest daughter used to have, Francisca. We don't really know what she had, but it is important because it was an opportunity for both girls to really have a ties with an European context. Then they come back to Brazil, but eventually both parents die and the now young ladies inherit their wealth. So they decide to come back to Paris and just settle down in Europe. It is a very bold move for two young ladies who were not married, who didn't really have that much of ties, but they had the wealth, and they had this particular position of really having some kind of financial knowledge for this time. But the most important thing about the Ivy House Museum is that they choose to ask for the people who stayed at the town to just keep the house as it was while the parents were alive. So it kind of becomes a museum before it even really became an official museum. So really, I chose to bring you guys a map for you guys to understand where really this small town is located. So really at this map, you can see Rio de Janeiro just down close to the bay, and then Vassouras, and this name means just brooms, is some kind of plant, is about a 2-hour car ride from Rio de Janeiro. So it's about, I don't know, 100 kilometers, something like this. And this on the right, you guys can see how the town looked like while the girls Francisca and Eufrasia used to live there. So the most interesting thing for me about this collection and the museum when we're talking about the sartorial collection is that like both sisters spent a long time in the other side of the Atlantic, right? Like they lived for 50, 60 years in Paris. And occasionally, since Francisca had this kind of disease, she eventually dies in 1899. But Eufrasia keeps on living in Paris. So the only moment where she really resumes and comes back to Brazil is between 1925 and 1930, where she comes back to Vassouras and resumes her living in this house that would become the Ivy House Museum because of the Ivy House on the facade. So when we would expect to see what she left there, and she never moved back to France. She got ill and died in Brazil in 1930. So we would expect for the collection to be something more related to an old lady. She was already 75 when she moved back to Brazil. But interestingly enough, most of the pieces I'm going to show you guys today are from the 1880s. That is, the sisters are in their mid-30s. They are thriving in Europe, and we don't really know why these pieces were kept here and why those pieces and not other pieces. They are very interesting, as we will see right now. So I wanted to highlight the mystery of having this unknown sartorial collection because we don't have this much of information on why they decided to keep this kind of collection, and even of who actually owned the pieces. One of the two sisters, the mother, a cousin, why? And there are so many questions to be answered. So actually the museum contains a 44-item collection, so it is a lot of things. I'm not going to show you guys everything. I chose to select 15 of those pieces because they come from very successful Maison de Haute Couture from Paris. So we were talking about Charles Worth, Maison Félix, and also a very interesting selection of shoes, both from Brazil and from France, especially. So the main interpretation, as I've told you, was that these pieces were supposed to be related to Euphrasia's last years, so when she was supposed to be an old lady. But this is really not the case, and we will see that instead, the pieces are very much more like young related or something to be some kind of ball related, socially, like a moment where people were wanting to be seen. So we can estimate most items to be from between the 1870s and roughly the 1910s, but usually from the 1870s to the 1890s. So really we have the two first items. It is a black velvet ball gown on the left, and you guys can also see just on the wall, hanging on the wall, one of the only two paintings that we have from Eufrasia. I really like the fact that she seems to have a very short hair here, very modern to her time, but we don't really have any like formal pictures of her, just two paintings. And on the right, we have here this riding costume in purple velvet with a high neckline and this high color in pink wool. Here on the left, we have a very interesting coffee decorated ensemble. And this is the only piece that doesn't really belong to a very important Maison de Haute Couture, but I wanted to bring this because the coffee was such an important thing for this family and the tradition of the family that someone even decided to prepare a coffee leaf decorated skirt. And let's also remind that coffee was so important for Brazil at the time that it was even present at the local flag, the imperial flag of the country at the time. Really, now here on the right, we have this Maison Felix example. Let's also consider that Maison Felix was one of the main competitors of Charles Worth. So we are considering that like this was a family who was really able to kind of stroll around the main references of Paris of this time. It is also interesting, I didn't have the opportunity to really bring the etiquettes, but most of these items have the etiquette, so we can kind of estimate also that they belong to the 1880s, 1890s because of this. Really, here considering the coats, we have a short coat in this burgundy velvet with applications, and we have also a sortie de théâtre coat with a high neckline, and both belong to Charles Worth. Two other pieces from Charles Worth are these coats, a riding coat on the right and this short coat with lots of details on the left. And this other coat kind of reminds me of the first one with a short beige wool coat. And now we are going to consider also a little bit about the shoes. This is a kid skin shoe on the right, a green one that comes from House Stearns & Sons. So this kind of bootmakers were pretty much the equivalent when we talk about shoes of the Maison de Haute Couture for clothing. So this was the easiest pair that I could identify because inside of in the sole and inside of the shoe is very easy to actually read the brand. So it was the easiest one to identify. But we have some other ones which are also very beautiful and very interesting to identify as well, because they are a little bit harder when it comes to brands to consider from which brand they come from. We have this creamy pair on the left with the silk kind of ribbon, and this green and mauve pair with detailed sequin embroidery making a flower motif on the vamp. I even had some kind of help from textile conservatives to understand what kind of motif and to identify the flower pattern. So I can tell you guys later what kind of flower this is really being shown here on this kind of shoe. Here we also have silk mull with a metal thread. This is also some kind of flower motif here with the metal thread, and a black and green pair with floral embroidery as well. These motifs were basically seen during the 1875s or between like the 1870s and 1890s as well. So they are pretty much related. They match pretty much the period of the previous clothings. This one is one of my favorites and is going to be also the last piece I'm going to show you guys today because it's very different from the other pieces. It is an Albert model. It is very similar to our current slippers, and it is also harder to identify because it could come from a wider time period. This could be an evolution from the ballerinas from the beginning of the 19th century, but most interestingly, it could belong to a man. I really like this pair because we can see an etiquette inside of the shoe telling that it comes from a Rio de Janeiro actually shoemaker, but the person seems to come from Paris. And the only shoe store that I managed to identify to belong to such a bootmaker opened in 1836 and closed in 1838. But this was way before Euphrasia was even born. She was born in 1850. So it's really harder to understand why someone would keep some kind of pair of shoes, although they are really nice and beautiful to see. But why would a family keep some kind of pair of shoes from way before their daughters would be even born? I also have some kind of hints that this Mr. Guilherme could be Guillaume Struzer, who was a bootmaker in Paris from the 1840s on. I think it would be very interesting to know more about this possibility and if this Struzer bootmaker really had a Brazilian adventure. The only info that I managed to get, and you guys can see here on the left, is an ad showing that this Alexandre Guilherme bootmaker really had a store here in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, and I really like this tiny drawing about the shoes. And then a final ad in 1856 explaining that the person is moving back to Europe, and then there is going to be an auction where he's selling everything, including tools and skilled enslaved people who know how to make shoes. So this is a confirmation that the person really moved to Europe, but we don't know his whereabouts since then. So to conclude today, this collection is very based into a very prestigious brands and important fabrics from their time, especially silks, kidskin. Many of the pieces present super detailed embroidery. These maison de haute couture are central references from Parisian fashion from the 1880s, 1890s. So we are talking about someone who knew where she was going to buy her pieces and how she was going to afford it. The labels are very important to estimate the items period, but their information is kind of limited. So we don't really know how these dynamics of ordering the pieces happen or why they came to Brazil. I really like the coffee themed dress because it is a symbol of a Brazilian economic between like this second half of the 19th century and also the origin of the family. About the shoes, they seem to be from 1875, more or less. So this is more than 40 years before Euphrasia is going to die. So it's also a mystery, like why are they keeping these kind of pieces? And the only model that can be associated with the 1920s comes from a prestigious shop, is the first one I showed you, the green kidskin one. And this kind of matches what we could expect from a clothing taste from a wealthy lady of her time. So Euphrasia seems to be someone kind of predictable when it comes to taste because she really likes important brands from her time. So we can understand this kind of personality through the clothing as a wealthy lady from Paris. The last model was probably being bought before, like the shoe model was probably being bought before Euphrasia was even born. So there are more stories to be found behind these items. The shoes are in very good conditions. The clothes are in correct to good conditions, but contrary to all expectations, the items are not from the 1920s, 1930s, when she was already an old lady. So I like to think that they are a material version from memories and histories of Euphrasia and her family, since at least one of them could have belonged to someone else. And that's it for the presentation.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. That was fascinating. What an amazingly unexpected collection to have there. It's always amazing to hear about pieces that are in places that we haven't really considered. Small museums like that hold those kinds of things. So I'm going to hand over to Anna, who is going to take over the the chat.
Okay. So thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. There's some questions in the chat. So Chris has started off with Euphrasia was engaged but didn't marry. I mean, how much do you know about the biography and personal life of this enigmatic person?
So this is a very interesting question. Yes, there are a few biographies about Euphrasia if you guys are interested. I don't really like them, I'm going to be honest, because usually as we don't really know that much about her financial life, her work life, then the engagement becomes the core of the explanation. So yes, she was engaged. She's been engaged for 15 years to a Brazilian politician called Joaquim Nabuco. He's a well-known historic character, but it didn't work out at the end and she never married. However, we can have some documentation about her investment practices and work because of her inventory. It's the main documentation source because the will was kind of controversial. Euphrasia actually wanted to give all her money to the city of Vassouras, and she did it mostly. So of course the family was not very interested in this kind of solution, but eventually the attorneys managed for her will to be actually considered and done. So this is the main information that we have about her. I'm looking for more documentation, actually.
So Kate is kind of, you picked up what some of the things Kate's asking, how much documentary archive remains? You know, what have you got to work with here?
We have the whole museum. If you guys ever come to Brazil, it is very interesting because of the wishes of the sisters, both of Euphrasia and Francisca. The house was more or less kept as it should be during the 1870s when they were young ladies and they decided to go to Paris. Then we have the documentation of her will, the legal documentation in general that is not in the museum, but it is in the same city. So eventually it would be interesting to digitalize everything for more people to be able to see it. And I have a hint that there is some more information also in France or in Europe, since she lived there for a long time. I done a few, like a bunch of research in France, but maybe in some personal correspondence, her name will be found in different kind of noble circles from their time.
Interesting. So, what's your plans? Are you writing this up? Are you publishing?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, at some time I would love to. Yeah, I would
Tell
love
us
to
all
find more
about it when you
information.
get going on it. That'd be fascinating.
Definitely.
And in fact, there's an important message from Robin in the chat. We're hoping to plan out our future at home, so we'd love to hear from you. Have you got a new project, an idea, something you'd like feedback on, something you presented in the past and you want to update us on? Please come and share with us, and the link is in the chat for you to do that. We always want to hear from you.
Thanks.
I'm just scrolling through the chat. So Alden's done a lot of replying. Thank you, Alden. That's amazing. You've written so much.
I'm
Nico.
sorry, it means that I missed a lot of what Cecilia said, and I'm terribly sorry to be rude, but I did want to answer people, and it just means I'll catch it on the recording.
Yeah, cool. So Nico is saying, what a beautiful collection. I think we'd all echo that. I mean, it's just breathtaking, the quality of the garments and the shoes particularly. During your time researching, did you find any writings of the sisters that helped you identify the pieces, or any kind of angles on them that you can build on, and what they might have been worn for and what their stories are?
There are a few mentions. Well, first of all, Eufrasia worked as an investor in a town where women were forbidden actually to go to the actual stock exchange. So she must have worked at home. We have some information from her maid, who was also called Cecilia by coincidence, that she mostly worked by writing. So we could expect that she would have some kind of really thick correspondence. Sadly, this is not really the case. We have a few letters that she received, and inside of the inventory, there are a few correspondences, letters, writings, memos that she wrote especially to her representatives in France while she was in Brazil. So I would really like to find something as an invoice from one of these maisons. I haven't yet, but I think it would be a real interesting way of understanding a little better how she used to work and the kind of consumption habits that she would like to entertain.
Oh, and we've probably got time for one more, haven't we, Kate?
Great.
So to finish on, Eileen is saying, how absolutely fascinating. How did you find out about this amazing museum, and what in particular grabbed your interest and led you to this research?
This is a nice story, and thanks for this question. Actually, when I was finishing my first book, the one about the shoes, something that began to bother me was that often when we go to the museums, we see very beautiful pairs, but we don't really know anything about their belonging, the story of like how they were bought, who decided to buy them, or why. I've seen this kind of hit, for example, in Chile, because many of like the daughters of the presidents, this kind of situation led to more information about the context about the pairs. This really started to bother me, so I started asking around. So where there was a museum where I could have a pair of or a collection of sartorial goods that I could actually relate to a family, to someone, to start actually pulling the threads to understand better the situation, the context. And I was trying to solve a mystery, and I actually found another mystery, because I think this collection is super interesting, exactly because we don't understand how it was first composed, but this was the intention, to really be able to understand better and to tie the actual goods to someone, to people, to stories in flesh and blood.
Amazing. Thank you very much indeed, Cecilia. I think you've answered the questions really well. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia, and we'd love to hear about how your research goes as you go along. So keep in touch and let us know if you find out any more of the answers to that.
Of course. And
Excuse
if
me.
you guys want to reach out, I'm always an email away.
Amazing, thank you.
Thanks.
So our final speaker today is Linda McShannock. Linda is the retired curator of the Minnesota Historical Society's textile collection, and her research is focused on women's traditional textile roles, looking at employment as needleworkers, dressmakers, milliners and tailors. So it fits in really well with our theme today. And her title of her talk is A Living for the Earnest, A Fortune for the Capable, Dressmaking in Minneapolis, 1880 to 1920. So over to you, Linda.
I will share my screen and see how that goes this time.
Brilliant.
Now, can you see it? Slideshow. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, you're there.
I'm
Brilliant.
not muted?
No, you're fine.
Yes. Fabulous. So I wanted to say, Cecilia, what bothered you about the lack of information or provenance on the items in the collection you were researching is exactly what led me to my research. As Alden said, generations of women were taught sewing skills, and my focus is on what enabled them to earn a living. Though the garments they made survive in museum collections, my interest was the interrelationships between the business owner, her clients, and the workers in these shops. This title was a claim from a local dressmaking school in Minneapolis that their students could earn a living for the earnest and a fortune for the capable. So, yeah, there's where we are at the Minnesota History Center, and in red is the state of Minnesota, so you have the location where I worked for about 30 years. This research centers around dressmaking businesses operating in the state of Minnesota who used identifying labels in their garments. The MHS collection holds we estimate about 25,000 items of textiles and clothing dating from about mid-century to the present. And over 100 of these garments have labels in their petershams representing 25 businesses operating in the two largest Minnesota cities. Compiling information from the classified section of the local city directory, we see that the industry grew rapidly, peaked in 1895, and then declined just as rapidly. The increased numbers of dressmakers in the city kept pace with the increased population of the state, which grew 78% between 1870 and 1880, and another 69% the next decade. By 1900, the dressmakers as a group declined, but the population in Minnesota continued to grow. By 1917, the industry here had almost completely disappeared. This was a pivotal moment for Minnesota, which became a state in 1858. Indigenous nations were removed from their ancestral lands. Abundant natural resources extracted through milling and mining, along with innovations in rail transportation, enriched early settlers and attracted industrial tycoons. Paris fashion trends, the wealthiest of the settlers sought elegant dress to reflect their new status. This was a mobile population with connections across the country and an active social life. The Minnesota couturiers featured here had connections to Paris and other fashion centers. The silhouette was up to date, showing a familiarity with the latest European fashion trends, although it may have been interpreted in less costly materials or in a more conservative cut suitable to Minnesota social activities, climate, and traditions. Represented in these next slides are 5 of the largest establishments in Minneapolis and St. Paul. They employed between 40 and 100 workers each and were in business for as many as 30 years, operating in what today would be million-dollar enterprises. When I first started this research, and a newspaper article said Madam Boyd, for instance, employed 100 seamstresses in her shop, I was not willing to believe that that was true. And so that is the phrase that sent me down this particular rabbit hole to find out the truth of the matter. Mary Worley was the earliest dressmaker to use a label in the Twin Cities. When Paris-based Charles Frederick Worth began signing dresses with sewn labels, the modern luxury brand was born. Known as the celebrated Mrs. Worley, she was the earliest dressmaker in the area to use a printed label. She managed the dressmaking department of a local dry goods store, Mannheimer's, which had built a 3-story dressmaking department to set up to handle as many as 130 workers. According to contemporaries, designer Mary Malloy sourced luxury goods from Europe and was St. Paul's most expensive and fashionable dressmakers. Her credit was rated by Dun & Bradstreet as limited because she had a large family and a worthless husband. In the 1880 manufacturing census, they recorded 50 employees at Worley's, earning an average of $1.25 a day. Mary Malloy was another prominent dressmaker in St. Paul. Trained by Paris-born Madame Parquet, she operated out of a 3-story downtown business block. Existing photographs show at least 40 workers in this business. She retired in 1913, protesting the change in fashion, bemoaning the one-piece dress. Madame Boyd catered to the most elite clientele and reportedly went abroad twice a year, quote, so that our styles shall come to us firsthand from the very heart of fashion's citadels. At least 43 of her garments survive in several collections in the Twin Cities. There's an example of one of her labels. It changes over time, and additional examples of her work. Her business locations followed the growth of the city. By 1910, she offered her clients a salon experience in the former Fred Pillsbury Mansion, brother to Minnesota Governor Charles Pillsbury. This Richardsonian Romanesque building was built in 1888 by Leroy Buffington, a nationally known architect for one of the leading families in Minneapolis, known for making the city the flour milling capital of the world. By then, her staff had grown to 100 designers, fitters, and seamstresses. She operated from this site until her death in 1917. The link between the dressmaker and her client is suggested by Mrs. Weyerhaeuser's brief diary entry. Mrs. Weyerhaeuser was her client, and she simply noted, Madame Boyd died today. Lena Christensen and her sisters operated another large fashionable concern, employing as many as 40 workers at the height of the season in their downtown location. After a fire in the premises in 1900, she sued her insurance company for undervaluing her losses. The quality of her imported goods is recorded in court transcripts from testimony on her behalf by salesmen from European fabric suppliers who sold goods to the most exclusive businesses in the city. The suit went to the Minnesota Supreme Court, where she won her case for a $28,000 settlement. And this was 1900. Mrs. George Hall started out in Minneapolis and moved her business to Chicago shortly before she died. She too used exclusive fabrics acquired in Europe. For example, this bodice is not embroidered, but is a supplemental weft weave silk with a striking pink lily and green foliage pattern. And how I wish I knew what the skirt looked like. The financial and social relationships between dressmaker and client were clearly intertwined. The dressmaker did not succeed without word of mouth promoting her services. If a client was not satisfied with a garment, she may have chosen to take her business elsewhere and may have expressed her dissatisfaction within her social network. The social news reported in the local paper added to the dressmaker's reputation when it was reported that a client's wedding party was outfitted exclusively with dresses from her shop. So there are, social news in the newspaper will say exactly where those dresses came from often. Two opposing views of the dressmaker were prevalent in the literature of the day. She was described as either a dictator or a victim. Depending on who told the tale, she craftily imposed style for the sake of change, marked up her prices, and caused her clients endless distress. Or she was the hardworking victim who was at the mercy of her wealthy clients, who ordered what they did not need and could not pay for, neglected to keep appointments, and needed to be wooed with false compliments. A client of Mrs. Worley's wrote of her disappointment when she was unable to attend a dinner party after insisting to Mrs. Worley insisting on Thursday when she wrote to her that it be ready no later than 4 o'clock Saturday afternoon. And here's the letter that she wrote to her daughter to say that she absolutely needed that dress. And then she didn't need it, but she did have her portrait taken in that dress, where we know this one was made by Mrs. Worley. We don't know if Worley's clients were in arrears, but when Boyd died in 1917, she had $22,000 in accounts receivables, indicating that she too had clients who had not paid her on time. Mary Hill, who was the wife of railroad tycoon James J. Hill, continued to have her garments made by Mrs. George Hall after Hall moved her business to Chicago. Mrs. Hill and her daughters used Hall's services exclusively from 1900 to 1904. Entries in Mrs. Hill's diary documented their train trips to Chicago for visits. We found, she quotes, I quote, we found Mrs. Hall ready for us, spent all forenoon selecting materials, the afternoon taking over designs and some fitting. She also noted in the same entry that she really disliked having her portrait taken. She's looking away from the camera. While dressmakers were in the business of making and remodeling clothes, their clients were actively involved in their own wardrobe selection and production. Mrs. Douglas wrote a book about her debutante years, including a story about restyling her own clothes and being snubbed by Madame Boyd, who assumed her dress was made by a competitor. Douglas, in her memoirs, pointed out that Boyd would often price her dresses to suit her client's ability to pay. The dresses could cost from $200 to $500, which is in today's dollars several thousand. Bessie stated, if one bought a model dress before it had been copied, the price was high, but one could be sure there would not be another dress like it in the city. Exclusivity was important to their clients. Besides the most elite clientele, Boyd's customers included women who ran their own businesses, such as Josie Wanis, one of the first women pharmacists in Minneapolis. Josie's pharmacy served the same clientele as the elite dressmakers, and she in turn had her own dresses made by these dressmakers. This dress was a very practical piece for Josie to own. It had a second bodice and a dicky, so it could go from day dress to dinner dress to evening dress using the same skirt. Women had narrowly defined roles in the 19th century with few employment options. Dressmaking was one occupation that provided an opportunity for acceptable employment for immigrant women, young farm girls, married women, or widows. Seamstress jobs in the late 1800s and early 1900s were demanding, low-paying, and seasonal. They required women to work 6 10-hour days per week with overtime common during the peak social seasons, often without extra pay for those hours. Business dropped over the summer months, putting many out of work. Christensen notes that in the summer, as she was preparing to go to Europe, her shop was down to 5 core members. These are examples of the seamstresses in about early 1900 to 1906, taken of Malloy's business. So you can see the operations that were happening and the handwork that was happening in that shop. It's a pretty amazing series of photographs. By 1890, Minnesota led the nation in women working away from home as they left rural areas to work in the city. These were the names of the employees at Madame Boyd's in the year 1900. Each shop, I quote Wendy Gamber from the Female Economy, each shop, no matter how small, relied on 2 labor forces, one highly skilled, amply compensated, and relatively permanent, the other less skilled, poorly paid, and temporary. This was clearly the case in Boyd's establishment. 19 of her employees were under age 25. Most were single and worked for a relatively few years. Others, like Clara Bakke, highlighted here, dedicated their lives to their craft. And this chart shows Clara Bakke's work history taken from census and city directory sources. Clara was one example of an unmarried woman who spent her entire career doing skilled work as an employee for elite shops. She worked for a number of dressmakers named in the center, though she spent many years at Boyd's. She was specifically a skilled skirt maker. In 1900, she was 38 years old and lived with her parents and siblings. After Madame Boyd's death, she found employment as a machine operator at the Stevenson's clothing factory. By the 1910s, factory and department store jobs often offered women more appealing opportunities, better hours, and better pay. Fewer women worked as seamstresses as demand for women's labor multiplied in these new professions and industries. At the same time, the production of fashionable ready-made clothing reduced the number of clients. The younger generation sought fashionable ready-to-wear, cutting into the dressmaker's business, and dressmaking as an industry declined. Here's my list of sources, the Minnesota Historical Society's homepage. There's a Minipedia article about custom dressmaking, which includes a bibliography. I have a web page that MHS hosts. Unfortunately, it's been archived, but that's the link to it. The other link, so where I have for each of the 25 dressmakers, I have a page outlining what we learned about them, and then examples of whatever photographs or maps or resources we have to supplement their story. And that can be accessed if you go to the Minnesota Society's homepage, and at the binoculars, you type in the word dressmakers and it will take you to the archive. So thank you for the opportunity to present my research, and this has been very fun. Thanks.
That was wonderful, Linda. I think the amount of research that has gone into those 25 dressmakers is just astounding and demonstrates what is going on in countless other towns and cities everywhere. I think it's just remarkable. So thank you so much.
And this was just the tip of the iceberg.
Anna, I'm going to hand over to you for the question.
Yeah, well, I think we're all a bit sort of blown away by the opulence and the incredible workmanship and amazing details on those gorgeous ensembles. I mean, comments, the bird dress takes my breath away. Look at those flower sleeves. We were just going, wow. It's like, so I shall compose myself. So Cecilia is saying, Linda, how on earth did you manage to find this documentation or even the photographs? This must have been a challenge, and I would say a really time-consuming one as well. How have you managed this, Linda?
Well, it was about 30 years worth of work. I was inspired by Sharon Fievel's exhibit on dressmaking in 1979, I think it was, and I bought in St. Louis, Missouri. She was curator at the Historical Society there. And I bought the catalog, and at the same time, we were unpacking clothing at MHS that had been boxed for decades, and were finding the labels in the Petersham, which nobody had ever paid attention to. So we started recording. You can imagine the excitement of one box after another, and you go, oh, there's another one, there's another one. So over time, I had interns and volunteers, and whenever we had spare time, we combed city directories, Sanborn maps, fire insurance maps. When newspapers came online, that was a wonderful source. One of my favorite sources is want ads in the newspaper. The city directory search, I have a database where we compiled through the year 1900 in Minneapolis. Over time, combed through all the entries in the city directory and recording anybody who had the least suggestion that it was a job related to textiles. So I have a database of 5,000 names from the year 1900. And that's what led me to, when you have a database, you get to sort information. And so I could see the names of the people who worked for each of these dressmakers, and I could categorize what level of you know, how many workers were in a particular place. And then there are, I had an intern who found a notice about this Supreme Court case. And so we found in our archive, we have a 1,500-page transcript of the Supreme Court case. I went to probate records, you know, just anything I could come up with. I browsed Wendy Gamber's bibliography for hints on where to go. And so I went to the Baker Library at Harvard to check out the Dun and Bradstreet credit reports. I had all sorts of good information there. So it was just a lot of solving mysteries and really, really fun research.
So the next question is, where have you published? Where can we read this?
The webpage is the closest I have to publishing. I've struggled with whether or not it is, I should do more with it. There was an exhibit.
Yes, please.
There was an exhibit at the Minneapolis Art Institute shortly before I retired, where we coordinated with Mia and presented this work in an exhibit, which was pretty fabulous. It broke attendance records when nobody believed that anyone would go to an art exhibit to see dresses. Yes.
Amazing.
Yeah. So there's a lot more. Madame Boyd's, there's just a lot more. Madame Boyd's probate records is a 15-page inventory of everything that was in her house, including which model garments she had from which Parisian dress couturiers, fabrics, you know. So between Miss Christensen and Madame Boyd, there's a whole nother lifetime. I intend to have this material archived in the Minnesota Historical Society, because there's just so much more detail than I can put in a presentation.
Wow, well, there's so many comments saying thank you, this is so impressive, this shows lifelong research, what wonderful information, what wonderful examples. Yeah, we just want you to write the book, Linda.
All right. I have to live long enough, right? Anyway, thank you.
That was such an amazing collection of papers. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It's been such a treat. I'd just like to, before everybody heads off, and before we do one more big thank you for everyone here, I just wanted to say, where's Robin? Robin's had a big week. She has, her book, The Mac, has been published this week by Yale University Press. And I just wanted to say big congratulations from us all for Robin's publication. She's got a copy of it. Let's see it, Robin.
Sorry, thank you. I was sewing, and then I went into the room and there was fabric everywhere, and I started tidying. Anyway.
Yeah, look at that. Amazing. Well done, Robin.
Oh, that's really kind. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's an absolute, go order it. I've got my copy on the way, and so it is going to be a treat.
Oh, thank you. Do you know what? So since you've been so kind, actually, I did mean to come back anyway. By the way, I heard everything. I was just right there. But fascinating talks. I love them all. But our next at home is going to not. We're taking May off because like every weekend's a bank holiday weekend in the UK, it seems, or a holiday of some kind. So our next one is at the end of June. And it's going to be a little bit of a photography focus. And it is, well, I know I'm going to ramble about photography for a little bit. So I'm one of the people in it. So that is going to be that. You're very kind asking my name in the book. I'll put it in the chat in just a minute. But like Anna said, though, more importantly, earlier, I'll also put this in the chat. We want to hear from you, talk at our events. And somewhere I had that form handy, but I have too many tabs open now and I can't find it. Here it is. Well, it's going to be a different link, but we'd love
to Robin for it. We would love to hear from you, regardless of, it's not about academic papers or it's anybody who is interested in anything at all, but whether you're a student, whether you're an interested amateur, you don't have to be like doing professional things in museums or anything like that. We just want to hear from you. So yeah.
And there's a link for my book. It's called It's about the Macintosh building at Glasgow School of Art. So it's not fashion, it's architecture and design. There is cool fashion people in it, including Macintosh's floppy bow tie. But I do lots of different things. So it's about, you know, the famous building that burned down and all the things. So there you go.
So I think all that remains to be said, apart from that amazing news this week, is a really big thank you to Alden, to Cecilia and Linda for sharing just 3 such different, but actually it just shows how connected these threads are, and the kind of the creators and the makers who've left their mark. And it's been a real treat to hear about all of those. So thank you so much for joining us, and to everyone for listening, and do join us again soon.